November 1st, 1755, 9:40 a.m., Lisbon, Portugal. The bells of 40 churches ring across the city, calling the faithful to All Saints' Day Mass. Families dress in their finest clothes, preparing for one of the most important religious celebrations of the year. Children walk hand in hand with their parents through cobblestone streets lined with magnificent Baroque buildings. The Royal Opera House, inaugurated just 8 months earlier, stands as a testament to Portugal's wealth and sophistication. A theater so grand it can seat 600 people and accommodate 25 horses on its stage. What none of those 275,000 souls know is that 200 kilometers offshore, the ocean floor is about to rupture with a force that will be felt across 3 continents. In 10 minutes, the most prosperous city in Europe will begin to collapse. In 3 hours, Lisbon will be underwater. By sunset, the Portuguese capital will be a burning ruin, and the world will have witnessed the deadliest earthquake in European history. The morning of November 1st had begun like any other All Saints' Day in Lisbon. The city was at the height of its golden age, enriched by gold and diamonds flowing from Brazil, its empire stretching across 4 continents. The Tagus River was crowded with ships from around the world, their holds filled with spices from India, silk from China, and precious metals from the Americas. Lisbon wasn't just the capital of Portugal, it was one of the great commercial centers of the world. But 200 kilometers southwest of the city, something was stirring beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Along the complex system of faults that marked the boundary between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, enormous stresses had been building for centuries. The Earth's crust was being compressed, twisted, and deformed by forces so immense that, when they finally released, the energy would be equivalent to 32,000 nuclear bombs. At exactly 9:40 a.m., the seafloor ruptured. The earthquake began with a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. In the churches of Lisbon, where thousands of worshippers had gathered for morning mass, the first tremors were barely noticeable, just enough to make the candles flicker and set the church bells ringing softly. But within seconds, that gentle tremor became a violent shaking that would last for nearly 10 minutes. The ground beneath Lisbon began to move in ways that defied comprehension. Buildings that had stood for centuries started to sway like ships in a storm. The magnificent churches, with their soaring stone arches and heavy Baroque decorations, began to crack and crumble. In the Basilica de Santa Maria, the massive stone pillars that supported the roof started to buckle under the incredible forces. Father Antonio was celebrating Mass at the Igreja do Carmo when the shaking began. He had served this parish for 20 years, had seen storms and floods, but nothing had prepared him for what happened next. The stone floor beneath his feet began to undulate like water. The altar, carved from solid marble, started to slide across the sanctuary. Above him, he could hear the terrible sound of stone cracking and mortar falling. As the congregation tried to flee, the church began to collapse around them. The heavy stone roof, supported by flying buttresses that had been the pride of medieval architects, came crashing down. In seconds, a building that had taken decades to construct was reduced to a pile of rubble. Father Antonio and most of his congregation were buried beneath tons of stone and timber. Similar scenes were playing out across Lisbon. The earthquake was not a single shock, but a series of 3 major tremors, each more violent than the last. The second shock, which struck about 2 minutes after the first, was the most devastating. Buildings that had survived the initial tremor were shaken to pieces. Entire streets disappeared as the ground opened up in massive fissures, some of them 15 feet wide. The Paço da Ribeira, the magnificent royal palace that housed King José I and his court, began to disintegrate. The palace library, containing 70,000 volumes and priceless manuscripts documenting Portugal's maritime discoveries, was crushed under falling masonry. Paintings by Titian, Rubens, and other masters were destroyed in seconds. The royal archives, containing detailed records of Vasco da Gama's voyages and other historic expeditions, vanished forever. But the royal family was not in the palace that morning. By a stroke of fortune that would save the Portuguese monarchy, the princesses had requested to spend the holiday at their country residence in Belém, several kilometers west of the city center. The area around Belém, populated mainly by palaces and farms rather than dense urban buildings, suffered far less damage than central Lisbon. As the third and final shock subsided around 9:50 a.m., survivors emerged from the wreckage to find their world transformed. Where magnificent Baroque buildings had stood just minutes before, there were now piles of rubble and clouds of dust. The narrow medieval streets that had given Lisbon its character were blocked by fallen masonry. Bodies lay trapped under the debris, and the cries of the injured echoed through the devastated city. But the earthquake was only the beginning of Lisbon's ordeal. As survivors picked their way through the rubble, many made a fateful decision that would cost thousands of lives. They headed toward the waterfront, believing that the open space near the Tagus River would be safer than the narrow streets filled with unstable buildings. The Cais de Pedra, a magnificent marble quay that stretched along the riverfront, seemed like the perfect refuge. Hundreds of people gathered on this solid stone platform, thinking they had found safety. What they didn't know was that the earthquake had triggered something far more deadly than falling buildings, a tsunami that was racing toward Lisbon at the speed of a jet aircraft. The earthquake had displaced massive amounts of water on the ocean floor. Some estimates suggest that sections of the seafloor were lifted or dropped by as much as 20 meters, creating a series of waves that radiated outward from the epicenter like ripples in a pond. But these weren't ordinary waves. They were walls of water traveling at 800 kilometers per hour across the Atlantic Ocean. About an hour after the earthquake, people along the Lisbon waterfront noticed something strange. The Tagus River, which normally flowed steadily toward the sea, began to recede. The water level dropped so dramatically that parts of the riverbed that had never been exposed were suddenly visible. Ships that had been floating in the harbor were left sitting on the muddy bottom. To the people of 1755, this was a miraculous sight. Some saw it as a sign from God, a parting of the waters like the biblical story of Moses and the Red Sea. Curious crowds gathered along the waterfront to witness this unprecedented phenomenon. Children ran out onto the exposed riverbed to collect fish and shells. Adults marveled at the sight of shipwrecks and lost cargo that had been hidden beneath the water for decades. What they were actually witnessing was the drawback that precedes a tsunami, the ocean pulling back like a giant inhaling before delivering a devastating blow. But in 1755, no one understood this warning sign. The science of tsunamis wouldn't be developed for another century. At approximately 11 a.m., the first tsunami wave struck Lisbon. The wave that hit the Portuguese capital was estimated to be between 5 and 6 meters high, roughly the height of a 2-story building. But it wasn't just the height that made it deadly, it was the incredible volume of water and the speed at which it moved. The waves swept up the Tagus River with unstoppable force, carrying with it ships, debris, and everything else in its path. The Cais de Pedra, where hundreds of people had sought refuge, simply disappeared beneath the rushing water. The magnificent marble quay, along with everyone standing on it, was swallowed by the tsunami. Bodies and debris were swept inland as the wave penetrated deep into the city, flooding streets and squares that had never seen seawater before. The wave reached as far as the current location of the Arco da Rua Augusta, about 250 meters inland from the normal riverbank. Entire neighborhoods near the waterfront were inundated. The Arsenal Real, where Portugal's naval supplies were stored, was completely flooded. Warehouses filled with goods from around the world were swept away, their contents scattered across the city by the retreating waters. But the first wave was not the last. Tsunamis typically come in a series, and Lisbon was struck by at least 2 more waves over the following hours. Each wave brought fresh destruction, carrying away buildings that had survived the earthquake and drowning people who had managed to escape the initial flooding. As if earthquake and tsunami weren't enough, Lisbon now faced a third catastrophe: fire. The earthquake had struck on a religious holiday when churches were filled with lit candles. As buildings collapsed, these candles ignited the wooden debris, starting fires throughout the city. The tsunami had also overturned cooking fires and oil lamps in homes and businesses, creating additional sources of ignition. With the city's water supply disrupted by the earthquake and the fire department overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, the fires spread unchecked. Strong winds fanned the flames, creating a firestorm that consumed everything in its path. The fire burned for 6 days, destroying buildings that had survived both the earthquake and the tsunami. The Royal Opera House, that magnificent symbol of Portuguese culture and wealth, was consumed by the flames. The hospital Real de Todos os Santos, the largest hospital in the city, burned to the ground with patients still inside. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash as the fire swept through the city like a living thing. feeding on the debris left by the earthquake. The human toll was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that between 10,000 and 15,000 people died in Lisbon alone, out of a population of 275,000. That means roughly 1 in 20 residents of the city perished in a single day. Across Portugal, Spain, and Morocco, the total death toll may have reached 60,000 people. But the Lisbon earthquake was more than just a local disaster, it was a global catastrophe. The tsunami waves crossed the Atlantic Ocean, reaching the Caribbean islands with heights of up to 3 meters. In Martinique, the waves were still 4 meters high when they arrived, more than 6,000 kilometers from their source. The earthquake was felt across Europe, from Scotland to North Africa, affecting an area of nearly 1 million square kilometers. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, please consider hitting that like button. It really helps us reach more people who are interested in understanding these incredible historical events. And if you want to see more content about natural disasters and their impact on human civilization, don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. The response to the disaster was led by Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, better known as the Marquês de Pombal, who served as the king's chief minister. Pombal took immediate control of the situation, implementing what many historians consider the first modern disaster response plan. He deployed the army to maintain order, organized the removal of bodies to prevent disease, and began planning the reconstruction of the city. One of Pombal's most important innovations was the creation of the first systematic study of an earthquake's effects. He sent questionnaires to parish priests throughout Portugal, asking detailed questions about the timing, duration, and intensity of the shaking in their areas. This information, collected from hundreds of locations, allowed scientists to create the first accurate map of an earthquake's impact and laid the foundation for the modern science of seismology. The reconstruction of Lisbon became a showcase for Enlightenment ideals of rational urban planning. Instead of simply rebuilding the medieval city that had been destroyed, Pombal and his architects created a new Lisbon with wide, straight streets designed to resist earthquake damage. They developed new construction techniques, including the famous Gaiola Pombalina, a flexible wooden framework built into the walls of buildings to help them withstand seismic shaking. To test these new designs, Pombal ordered his engineers to build scale models and then had troops march around them in formation. The synchronized footsteps of the soldiers simulated the rhythmic stresses of an earthquake, allowing the architects to identify and fix weaknesses in their designs. These were among the first seismic tests in architectural history, and the techniques developed in Lisbon influenced earthquake-resistant construction around the world. The philosophical impact of the Lisbon earthquake was equally profound. The disaster struck at the heart of Enlightenment optimism, challenging the belief that this was the best of all possible worlds. The fact that the earthquake occurred on a major religious holiday, killing thousands of people who were attending church, raised difficult questions about divine justice and the nature of evil. Voltaire, the great French philosopher, was deeply affected by the disaster. He wrote both a poem and his famous novella, Candide, in response to the earthquake, using the tragedy to critique the philosophical optimism of his time. The earthquake became a symbol of the random, meaningless suffering that seemed to contradict the idea of a benevolent universe. The economic impact of the earthquake was devastating. Portugal lost between 32% and 48% of its gross domestic product, a higher percentage than most countries affected by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. The destruction of Lisbon's port and commercial infrastructure disrupted trade routes that connected Europe with Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The cost of reconstruction strained Portugal's finances for decades. The disaster also had lasting effects on European culture and science. The Lisbon earthquake inspired new approaches to studying natural disasters, leading to advances in geology, seismology, and engineering. It influenced literature, philosophy, and art for generations. Most importantly, it marked the beginning of a more scientific approach to understanding and preparing for natural disasters. Today, more than 250 years after the Great Lisbon earthquake, the city bears few visible scars from that terrible November morning. The Pombaline downtown, with its earthquake-resistant buildings and rational street grid, still forms the heart of modern Lisbon. But the memory of 1755 lives on in Portuguese culture and in the scientific understanding of earthquakes and tsunamis that emerged from the disaster. The Lisbon earthquake was a turning point in human history, the moment when natural disasters began to be understood as scientific phenomena rather than acts of divine wrath. It showed that even the most prosperous and powerful cities were vulnerable to the forces of nature, and it demonstrated the importance of scientific study and rational planning in preparing for future disasters. The lessons of 1755 remain relevant today as cities around the world face increasing risks from earthquakes, tsunamis, and other natural hazards. The Marquis de Pombal's systematic approach to disaster response and his emphasis on building back better provide a model that is still followed by emergency managers and urban planners. If you're interested in learning more about how historical disasters have shaped our modern understanding of natural hazards, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We regularly explore these fascinating connections between past and present, showing how events from centuries ago continue to influence how we prepare for and respond to disasters today. The official death toll from the 1755 Lisbon earthquake stands at approximately 15,000 people in the city itself, with tens of thousands more killed across Portugal, Spain, and Morocco. But the true human cost extends far beyond these numbers. There are the families torn apart by the disaster, the children orphaned by the collapse of churches, the communities that disappeared entirely beneath the tsunami waves. The earthquake also revealed the interconnected nature of the 18th century world. A disaster that began on the seafloor off Portugal affected trade routes across 3 continents, influenced philosophical debates in France, and changed building practices from Brazil to India. It was perhaps the first truly global natural disaster, demonstrating how events in one part of the world could have far-reaching consequences everywhere else. In the end, the Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755 was more than just a natural disaster. It was a catalyst for the modern world. It sparked advances in science and engineering, influenced art and literature, and changed how humans think about their relationship with the natural world. The earthquake that destroyed medieval Lisbon gave birth to the rational scientific approach to disaster management that we still use today. The tremors that shook Lisbon on that November morning in 1755 continue to resonate through history, reminding us that no matter how advanced our civilization becomes, we remain vulnerable to the awesome power of the natural world. The story of Lisbon's destruction and rebirth serves as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder of nature's power and humanity's resilience in the face of unimaginable catastrophe.